Magnificent Delusions by Husain Haqqani, continued. Howard and Teresita Schaefer, in their book How Pakistan Negotiates with the United States, highlighted Pakistani leaders' tendency to consistently invoke negative domestic public opinion as a negotiating tactic. The Schaefers are both veteran American diplomats with extensive experience in South Asia. They have noted, with hindsight, what US officials ignore while dealing with Pakistanis. Pakistan has often used its weakness as a strategic asset in its negotiations with the United States, they point out. Sharif employed this having the lower hand tactic once again when Pakistan's military precipitated the Kargil crisis in the summer of 1999, creating the spectre of nuclear war. In December 1998, at Clinton's invitation, Sharif visited Washington. He sought the end of the sanctions imposed after Pakistan's nuclear tests. For his part, Clinton urged Pakistani action on terrorism and nudged Sharif toward India-Pakistan rapprochement. Soon after the visit, the US Embassy in Islamabad complained that the Pakistani government was not disposed to be especially helpful on the matter of terrorist Osama bin Laden. Pakistani officials apparently all took the line that the issue of bin Laden is a problem the US has with the Taliban, not with Pakistan. In an effort to persuade Pakistanis to change their policy on Afghanistan, US Ambassador William Milam met with Foreign Minister Sartaj Aziz. He urged the Pakistani government to get active in trying to convince the Taliban to expel terrorist Osama bin Laden and to change its pro-Taliban policies. Have 4 years of all-out support for the Taliban improved Pakistan's position? Milam asked Aziz. He insisted that Pakistan needed to use its influence with the Taliban to convince them to expel bin Laden to a place where he could be brought to justice. The ambassador found that Aziz listened carefully, but his response contained little that was new. Meanwhile, the Pakistanis began their dialogue with India. The two countries agreed to open the passenger bus service between Delhi and Lahore. On February 20th, 1999, Indian Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee travelled to Lahore on the inaugural bus trip. Vajpayee's bus diplomacy led to a summit filled with symbolism and hope of warmer relations between the two nuclear-armed adversaries. Clinton then publicly commended the two prime ministers for demonstrating courage and leadership by coming together and addressing difficult issues that have long divided their countries. Except for Pakistani Islamists, who organised violent demonstrations, most Indians and Pakistanis supported Vajpayee's bus diplomacy. The Indian leader belonged to the Hindu nationalist Bharatiya Janata Party, BJP, which was seen in Pakistan as virulently anti-Pakistan. On Pakistani soil, he affirmed India's respect for Pakistan as a neighbour. This was meant to reassure Pakistanis who still believed in an existential threat from India. Finally, a Hindu nationalist stood under the Pakistani flag at the site where the demand for partition of India was first made. The dispute over Pakistan's right to exist had ended. Sharif, as head of the Muslim League, represented the hardline anti-India position. His willingness to negotiate with India symbolized Pakistan's desire for finally moving beyond the arguments of the partition in 1947. He reiterated Jinnah's desire for Pakistan and India to live as neighbours, like Canada and the United States. The two leaders agreed on an elaborate peace process. There would be a composite dialogue on all differences between the two countries, including the Kashmir issue. But they would not wait to ease travel restrictions and do business with one another until all issues were resolved. The détente had just begun when, in spring of 1999, the Indians discovered a Pakistani force occupying mountains on their side of Kashmir. Initially, Pakistan denied that it had crossed the line of control in Kashmir. Those occupying the mountains in Kargil, said Islamabad, were Kashmiri Mujahideen. The Indians, however, saw the occupation as a major escalation. The new Pakistani positions put India's major highway in Kashmir within shelling range. In response, India deployed its army as well as air force to evict the intruders. The architect of the military operation in Kargil was General Pervez Musharraf, a flamboyant officer who had replaced the mild-mannered Karamat as Pakistan's army chief a few months earlier. Musharraf had sent in troops drawn from Pakistan's Northern Light Infantry Division to occupy difficult mountainous terrain, hoping to force the Indians to negotiate a Kashmir settlement more quickly than the civilian peace process could achieve. However, he did not anticipate India's resolve to recover 51 square miles of barren, snow-capped territory. By June, the Indian forces had fought to recover most of the territory. India released a tape-recorded conversation between Musharraf and his deputy, Lieutenant General Aziz Khan, which left no doubt about Pakistan's actions in Kargil. Aziz was the same officer who, while serving at the ISI, had supported the Taliban and expressed disappointment at Bhutto's lack of fervour for Islam. The conversation between Musharraf and Aziz Khan took place while Musharraf was in Beijing and Aziz Khan at Army headquarters in Rawalpindi. The international community, including China and the United States, unanimously demanded Pakistan's withdrawal from Kargil. Thus, Musharraf and his fellow generals had managed to unite the international community against Pakistan. How the Indians got hold of the Musharraf-Aziz tape recording remains a mystery to this day. General Ihsan-ul-Haq, who served as head of military intelligence at the time, later told me what Pakistani generals suspected. The Americans had taped the conversation. It had been given to the Indians to embarrass Pakistan and force its withdrawal from the Kargil heights. The tape was just the first of a series of embarrassments that eventually forced Pakistan's retreat. Musharraf's blunder had created a South Asian version of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Vajpayee felt betrayed, whereas Sharif worried about a full-blown war. The Americans were concerned about reports that Pakistan's generals might use nuclear weapons to reverse defeat in conventional fighting. Sharif wanted to end the crisis, but he wanted to do so with a face-saver. He called Clinton on July the 2nd and appealed for American intervention immediately to stop the fighting and to resolve the Kashmir issue. A more desperate call followed the next day. Clinton felt that Sharif had gotten himself into a bind with no easy way out. The US president agreed to see him in Washington, but Sharif had to know that Clinton would not agree to intervene in the Kashmir dispute, especially under circumstances that appeared to reward Pakistan's wrongful incursion. When they met at Blair House on American Independence Day, Sharif told Clinton that he wanted desperately to find a solution that would allow Pakistan to withdraw with some cover. He found himself in a position similar to that of Ayub before Lyndon Johnson right after the 1965 India-Pakistan War. Pakistan could not win the war, but it would not accept defeat. Sharif told Clinton that the fundamentalists in Pakistan would move against him if he did not portray at least some success in moving Pakistan's case for Kashmir forward. Clinton spoke angrily about Pakistan's irresponsible behavior as it moved to the brink of nuclear war. He then took up the subject of terrorism. Bruce Riedel, who was present at the meeting, quoted Clinton as saying that the ISI worked with bin Laden and the Taliban to foment terrorism. Clinton said he had a draft statement that would also mention Pakistan's role in supporting terrorists in Afghanistan and India. Was that what Sharif wanted? Clinton asked. You've put me in the middle today, set the US up to fail, and I won't let it happen, he said. Pakistan is messing with nuclear war. Clinton's own account of the meeting says that he told Sharif, I would have to announce that Pakistan was, in effect, supporting terrorism in Afghanistan, unless Pakistan did more to help find bin Laden. On the day he met with Sharif, Clinton also signed an executive order placing economic sanctions on the Taliban, freezing its assets and prohibiting commercial exchanges. Clinton realized that the Pakistani military was full of Taliban and al-Qaeda sympathizers, and that Sharif did not have full control. But I thought we had nothing to lose by exploring every option, Clinton observed. At the end of that meeting, Sharif agreed to announce a Pakistani withdrawal from Kargil. Pakistan would restore the sanctity of the line of control. Clinton promised to take a personal interest in resuming the India-Pakistan dialogue. On returning to Pakistan, Sharif asked the army to proceed against those responsible for the military fiasco. Musharraf knew that his would be the first head to roll, so he went on a tour of Pakistan's garrisons to galvanize support for his position as their commander. In October, when Sharif tried to remove Musharraf from his position as army chief, Musharraf loyalists in the army, led by Aziz and Lieutenant General Mahmud Ahmed, overthrew the civilian government in a military coup. Sharif was arrested, and Musharraf assumed power first as chief executive and later as president. Most Americans saw the coup as cause for alarm in South Asia and the rest of the world, but there were some voices advocating the Pakistan Army's case. An editorial in the Wall Street Journal summed up the concerns of US officials about the direction Pakistan was taking. The first order of business for Washington should be to demand Islamabad's full cooperation in the anti-terror campaign, it said. The paper cautioned, Pakistan's generals may assume that having nukes will let them, like Russia, get away with murder. Any wobbling in Washington that confirms that impression makes murder almost guaranteed. Stephen Wiseman, who had spent years in South Asia as a reporter, asked, if Pakistanis are not capable of governing themselves, why would Pakistanis wearing uniforms be any different? Michael Crepon, a scholar, pointed to a different problem. The Pakistani army generals are trying to convince themselves that defeat in Kashmir was snatched from the jaw of victory by Sharif and his stupid diplomats, he said. This theory recurs in Pakistani history, and it is very dangerous. American conservatives embraced an alternative view. The frontrunner for the Republican nomination for the presidency, Texas Governor George W. Bush, could not name Musharraf in an interview for a Boston television station, but he nonetheless spoke positively of the new Pakistani general. Bush said, "It appears this guy is going to bring stability to the country, and I think that's good news for the subcontinent." In an article titled, Pakistan, Democracy is Not Everything, Richard N. Haas, who had served as a member of the National Security Council and special assistant when Bush's father was president, made the same argument in greater detail. Robert Bud McFarlane, who, as a Reagan advisor, had worked closely with Zia during the war against the Soviets, also publicly defended the coup. He described Pakistani democracy as a feudal cabal, and Pakistan's periods of military rule as more stable and prosperous. McFarlane claimed that military control is inevitable and in Pakistan's interest in the short term. But Pakistan's long-term stability would be possible only if the superpowers helped Pakistan secure a settlement of the Kashmir dispute, as the Pakistan Army demanded. This reflected the opinion of Pakistan's generals, who had for years put much else on hold in pursuit of an elusive victory over India. Musharraf, who was apprehensive about international isolation, was heartened by the support of those in the United States, who cherished memories of Pakistan's Cold War alliance with the United States. He appointed Malia Lodi, who had served as ambassador to the United States before, as his representative in Washington. Pakistan's policies on nuclear proliferation and terrorism, however, had not changed. But by changing faces, Pakistan hoped to win over the Americans once again. The Clinton administration did not trust Musharraf's new military regime. Musharraf spoke about changing Pakistan as it also continued to support the Taliban and Pakistani terrorist groups. Within a couple of months into his coup, an Indian Airlines passenger jet travelling from Kathmandu, Nepal, to Delhi was hijacked to Kandahar, Afghanistan. India released 3 prominent Kashmiri terrorists to secure the release of 155 hostages. Although there was no direct evidence of official Pakistani involvement, the released terrorists returned to heroes' welcomes in Pakistan. In January 2000, Clinton sent Inderfirth to Islamabad to seek Musharraf's help in capturing Abu Zubaydah, one of Osama bin Laden's key lieutenants who was believed to be living in Peshawar. The United States also demanded that Pakistan stop supporting terrorism in India and Kashmir. The Americans saw Musharraf's response as partially conceding the ISI's role in aiding the Kashmiri militants. He attached conditions to his agreement that they would stop. Pakistan, he said, would use its influence in Kashmir to calm the situation there if India reduced its own build-up of troops along the border. Musharraf promised that he would not stay in power any longer than required. Clinton was scheduled to visit the subcontinent in the spring of 2000, but India Firth conveyed that it would be difficult for Clinton to visit Pakistan if the country remained a dictatorship, and there was no progress on the issues that mattered to the United States. Musharraf warned that a presidential snub would strengthen the hand of the extremists, which was essentially what Sharif had said to Talbot in seeking American leniency before and after the Pakistani nuclear test. Clinton arrived in Bangladesh on March 18, 2000, for a week-long visit to the subcontinent. There was considerable debate within his national security team over whether to visit Pakistan. In the end, Clinton decided on a 5-hour stopover in Islamabad. "I'm going to try to keep us in the play there," he remarked, "both for what happens inside that country and for getting them to cut out the bad stuff they're doing in the region." The US Secret Service appealed to Clinton not to go to Pakistan because of the danger of assassination. The US president was effectively snubbing Musharraf by stopping in Islamabad for only a few hours. He spent 1 full day in Bangladesh and 5 days in 5 cities of India. Clinton explained in his memoirs that he decided to go to Pakistan to encourage an early return to civilian rule and a lessening of tensions over Kashmir, to urge General Musharraf not to execute the deposed Prime Minister, Nawaz Sharif, who was on trial for his life, and to press Musharraf to cooperate with us on bin Laden and al-Qaeda. Musharraf had agreed to somewhat humiliating conditions to be able to host Clinton, however briefly. For example, no one in military uniform could receive the president at the airport, and the 2 presidents would not be photographed shaking hands. Musharraf felt he needed the imprimatur of American engagement, if not US support, for his political longevity. He hoped that he would be able to convince Clinton of his worth, and that of Pakistan, as a US ally. As one of the conditions of his visit, Clinton had insisted that he be allowed to make a televised address to the people of Pakistan. In that speech, he tried to rebut the Pakistani narrative of America's relationship with their country. Clinton appealed to the Pakistani people to turn away from terror and nuclear weapons and turn toward a dialogue with India on Kashmir, to embrace the Test Ban Treaty, and to invest in education, health, and development rather than arms. Clinton described himself as a friend of Pakistan and the Muslim world, quoted Jinnah, and spoke of the real obstacles that were holding Pakistan back from achieving its full potential. He asked difficult questions such as, "Are you really more secure today than you were before you tested nuclear weapons? Will these weapons make war with India less likely, or simply more deadly? Will a costly arms race help you to achieve any economic development? Will it bring you closer to your friends around the world, closer to the partnerships you need to build your dreams?" He said he understood Pakistani concerns about Kashmir, but highlighted the stark truth that there is no military solution to Kashmir. Clinton posed other questions to Pakistanis. Will endless, costly struggle build good schools for your children? Will it make your cities safer? Will it bring clean water and better health care? Will it narrow the gaps between those who have and those who have nothing? Will it hasten the day when Pakistan's energy and wealth are invested in building its future? The speech was an attempt to deprive Pakistani leaders and diplomats of their constant argument that public opinion restrained them. Clinton was demonstrating that putting forward different arguments can change public opinion. He warned of the danger that Pakistan may grow even more isolated. He laid out an alternative vision for Pakistan, rooted in tomorrow's promise, not yesterday's pain, rooted in dialogue, not destruction. Then he concluded by saying, "If you choose that future, the United States will walk with you. I hope you will make that choice." In their private meeting, Musharraf stuck to the traditional Pakistani script, nor did the Pakistani media follow Clinton's public appeal with similar messages aimed at altering the Pakistani narrative. As soon as Clinton left the country, Pakistan's media reverted to its usual pattern. The United States was accused of siding with India, ignoring the just Kashmir cause and acting as an imperial power. Moreover, Pakistani officials continued to flatly deny allegations of Pakistani support for the Taliban and the Kashmiri Mujahideen. Clinton did succeed, however, in saving Sharif's life. Under a deal guaranteed by Saudi Arabia, Musharraf allowed the former Prime Minister to move to the kingdom with his family. Sharif promised to stay out of Pakistani politics for 10 years in return for a full pardon in the cases that had been initiated against him. In September 2000, the State Department noted an increase in direct Pakistani involvement in Taliban military operations. While Pakistani support for the Taliban has been long-standing, said a cable from Washington sharing intelligence with the US Embassy in Islamabad, the magnitude of recent support is unprecedented. Pakistan was apparently providing the Taliban with materiel, fuel, funding, technical assistance, and military advisors. Large numbers of Pakistani nationals had moved into Afghanistan to fight for the Taliban, ostensibly with the tacit acquiescence of the Pakistani government. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright advised the US ambassador to Pakistan to remind the Pakistanis that we will not accept a Taliban victory and do not believe others will either. She was still appealing to reason, not realizing that passion dictated decisions in Islamabad. Albright pointed out that a Taliban victory would bring not peace and stability, but rather further unrest. The only mildly threatening remark she made referred to further measures in the Security Council that would not serve Pakistan's interest. Under-Secretary of State Thomas Pickering followed up on Albright's warning. He told a Pakistani official in November of US disappointment with Pakistan's failure to help with capturing or killing Osama bin Laden. He warned of an arms embargo on the Taliban and asked for Pakistan's help. The United States, he said, would always act to protect US interests at a time and place of its own choice. Pakistan's generals had heard threats before, however, and this was not particularly menacing. In any case, the United States was mired in controversy over its presidential election, and, as in the past, Pakistan's leaders were willing to take their chances with the new administration. Islamabad welcomed the inauguration of George W. Bush as President of the United States. After all, during his campaign, Bush had spoken little about South Asia. Although in one speech he spoke of the arrival of India, the world's largest democracy, as a power of global significance, on other occasions he had expressed confidence that military rule might stabilize Pakistan. From Musharraf's point of view, that was a positive sign. The incoming National Security Advisor, Condoleezza Rice, believed that the United States needed Pakistan's cooperation in order to succeed in replacing the Taliban with a broad-based government in Afghanistan. But like the Clinton administration, the Bush team just did not know how to get Pakistan to shift from supporting the Taliban. Afghan-born academic Zalmay Khalilzad, who had dealt with Pakistan during the Reagan administration, was brought in to lead that effort. Vice President Dick Cheney worried about Musharraf's tenuous hold on power. Others were also concerned about Islamist radicals seizing power in Pakistan and gaining access to its nuclear arsenal. There was clearly a huge gap in the Bush administration's knowledge about Pakistan. Rice was surprised when Russian President Vladimir Putin brought up the subject of Pakistan during his meeting with Bush at the G8 summit meeting in Genoa in July 2001. He excoriated the Pervez Musharraf regime for its support of extremists and for the connections of the Pakistani army and intelligence services to the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, she wrote in her memoir. Putin said that the extremists were all being funded by Saudi Arabia, and it was only a matter of time until it resulted in a major catastrophe. We, of course, knew of the connections between Pakistan and the Taliban and had been hammering Islamabad, observed Rice. But I was taken aback by Putin's alarm and vehemence and chalked it up to Russian bitterness toward Pakistan for supporting the Afghan Mujahideen, who had defeated the Soviet Union in the 1980s. Only later did Rice realize that Putin was right. Pakistan's relationship with the extremists would become one of our gravest problems, she noted. Putin never let us forget it, recalling that conversation time and time again. Pakistani officials lied with impunity to visiting US officials. On August the 30th, Foreign Office officials in Islamabad told a team of congressional staffers that Pakistan did not support the Taliban. It only interacted with them. They denied that the ISI or any part of the government, armed or otherwise, assisted the Taliban militarily. Pakistan was a conscientious member of the UN, committed to support the UN sanctions against the Taliban, they claimed. The Pakistani officials said they found many Taliban policies against women personally distasteful, but insisted that they reflected more a medieval Afghan mentality prevalent in Afghan society than mainstream Islam. The officials advised that the United States engage with the Taliban, with one Pakistani diplomat stating, "Change comes slowly. Doing business with people promotes change. Corrupt the Taliban with aid and a reborn economy," he suggested. The Bush administration's ambivalence toward Pakistan ended on September 11, 2001, with the al-Qaeda attacks on the Pentagon and on New York's World Trade Center, in which more than 3,000 people were killed. The United States reacted strongly against what most onlookers saw as an act of war on U.S. homeland. American intelligence immediately identified the terrorists who had hijacked the planes before ramming them into symbols of American power. Given al-Qaeda's involvement, U.S. military action against Afghanistan was inevitable. The head of the ISI, Lieutenant General Mahmoud Ahmed, was in Washington at the time. He was summoned to the State Department the next morning for a short meeting with Deputy Secretary Richard Armitage, who delivered a terse message. Pakistan must either stand with the US in its fight against terrorism or stand against us. There was no maneuvering room. Armitage said that the right choice by Pakistan could lead to lifting of sanctions and a positive relationship with the United States. Mahmoud assured him of Pakistan's unqualified support and said that he spoke on Musharraf's behalf. 2 days after the 9/11 attacks, Wendy Chamberlain presented her credentials to Musharraf as the new US ambassador to Pakistan. In a 40-minute meeting following the presentation of credentials, Musharraf told the ambassador that Pakistan was with you in an action plan for Afghanistan. He emphasized repeatedly that Pakistan had been a frontline state in the past and would be a frontline state again. Chamberlain said bluntly that the September the 11th attacks had changed the fundamentals of the debate. Pakistan needed to act with the US, not to urge dialogue, but to act. Musharraf declared that we are together in this. Musharraf later received a phone call from Secretary of State Colin Powell. According to Musharraf's account of Mahmoud's conversation with Armitage and his own with Powell, the two US officials had threatened Pakistan. The Pakistani dictator understood their message as, "We should be prepared to be bombed back to the Stone Age if they did not comply with American demands." He wrote later that he wargamed the United States as an adversary and decided to switch alliance from the Taliban to the United States. The list of non-negotiable demands that Powell presented to Musharraf included unequivocal condemnation of the 9/11 attacks, denying al-Qaeda safe haven in Pakistan, sharing intelligence, granting overflight rights, and breaking diplomatic relations with the Taliban. There were also several specific requests for logistical support. Although Musharraf had agreed to submit to the US demands, the ISI was not willing to give up on its decades-long investment in Afghanistan. There was considerable debate within the Pakistan military about the extent to which Pakistan should support the United States. Musharraf announced his decision in an address to the Pakistani people. He alluded to the US threat and suggested that India would benefit if Pakistan did not cooperate with the Americans. "Our critical concerns, our important concerns, can come under threat," he said. "When I say critical concerns, I mean our strategic assets and the cause of Kashmir. If these come under threat, it would be a worse situation for us." He was implying that he was making a sacrifice on the Afghan front so that the Kashmir front could remain alive. The obligatory anti-American demonstrations and media hype soon followed the speech. Although the Americans thought they had won Musharraf over, Musharraf had made a tactical choice, not a strategic one. Mahmoud made 2 trips to Kandahar to meet Taliban leader Mullah Omar. He told Chamberlain that Omar wanted to pursue a negotiated solution and advised the Americans not to act in anger, saying that real victory will come in negotiations. According to the ISI chief, America's strategic objectives of getting Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda would best be accomplished by coercing the Taliban to do it themselves. If the Taliban are eliminated, he said, Afghanistan will revert to warlordism. The ISI did not want the Taliban defeated militarily. Mahmoud said he wanted Pakistan to avoid the fallout from a US attack on its neighbor. But the United States had already aligned itself with the Taliban's foes, the Northern Alliance, whereas the ISI had always seen the Northern Alliance as closer to India, Iran and Russia. Musharraf replaced Mahmoud with Lieutenant General Ihsan-ul-Haq so as to convince Americans that the ISI would not impede their military operations in Afghanistan. As the United States commenced bombing Afghanistan, hundreds of Pakistani military advisors and ISI operatives assisting the Taliban were evacuated. Although this could have been an opportunity to make a clean break with terrorist groups, Musharraf did not force the jihadi groups out of business. Pakistan was warehousing some extremists and leaving others untouched. Some Pakistani officials, reported Paul Watson of the Los Angeles Times, argued that action against Pakistani jihadis would alienate Pakistan's religious groups. Militant groups were banned amid fanfare, and sometimes their leaders were detained. But then the groups re-emerged under new names, and courts freed the detained leaders, claiming lack of evidence. Over the next few years, the United States and Pakistan lapsed into a now familiar pattern. The United States provided large amounts of economic and military aid, including a fresh batch of F-16 aircraft, some frigates for the Navy, and updated equipment for the Army. Pakistan handed over several al-Qaeda figures that the CIA and FBI had located in Pakistani cities, particularly in the first 2 years after 9/11. In a unique arrangement, Pakistan also received reimbursement for what it spent to fight terrorism. Total aid and reimbursement between 2002 and 2012 amounted to $25 billion. However, Pakistan made no fundamental shift in attitude toward Afghanistan or India. An attack by Kashmiri militants on the Indian Parliament soon after December 2001 resulted in the threat of another India-Pakistan war. Although both sides mobilized along the border, US diplomacy was able to defuse the crisis. Musharraf also agreed to go through the motions of a peace process with India, which yielded no substantive result. By 2005, the Taliban had resurfaced in Afghanistan. American intelligence discovered, once again, that the Taliban's activities were being directed from Pakistan, while, as before, Pakistan denied its involvement. Further, terrorists involved in attacks on trains in Spain and on London's subway were found to have trained in Pakistan. Several countries' intelligence services stressed Pakistan's position as a principal recruiting ground and logistical center for global terrorists. What's more, Pakistan's half-hearted participation in the war against terrorism made it a major victim of terrorism. Some jihadi groups determined that they would wage war on the Pakistan Army and the ISI, in addition to fighting the West and India. Junior military men from secret cells linked to al-Qaeda twice targeted Musharraf for assassination. Thus, Pakistan's tolerance of extremism allowed new, more virulent offshoots of old groups. Terrorist attacks in Pakistani cities claimed thousands of lives. Instead of rallying the people against these extremists, however, Pakistan's establishment termed it the price Pakistan paid for supporting the United States. Officials demanded even greater monetary compensation from the United States for the losses Pakistan suffered on account of allying itself with the US-led war on terror. Clerics, politicians and journalists blamed America rather than the Taliban for terrorist attacks in Pakistan. Once again, anti-Americanism had provided refuge against honestly facing Pakistan's own problems. Bush acknowledged that Musharraf either would not or could not fulfill all his promises. According to Bush, part of the problem was Pakistan's obsession with India. In almost every conversation we had, Musharraf accused India of wrongdoing. 4 days after 9/11, the Pakistani ruler had told Bush that the Indians were trying to equate us with terrorists and trying to influence your mind. Although Bush had invested heavily in securing Pakistani cooperation against al-Qaeda and the Taliban, he found that the Pakistani military spent most of its resources preparing for war with India. Its troops were trained to wage a conventional battle with its neighbour, not counter-terrorism operations in the tribal areas. The fight against the extremists came second. When Bush visited the subcontinent in 2006, he signed a civil nuclear deal with India, which was tantamount to accepting the legitimacy of India's status as a nuclear power. Pakistan, however, could not get such a deal because it was unwilling to submit to any international discipline. Pakistani nuclear scientist Dr. A.Q. Khan had been found running an illicit network that traded in designs and material for uranium enrichment to Libya, North Korea, and Iran. Instead of coming clean, Pakistani officials had fulminated against Indian and Zionist plots. This precluded any possibility of bringing Pakistan's nuclear program out of the shadows. The highlight of Bush's trip to India included the civil nuclear deal and agreements on US investment. In Pakistan, the US president arrived to the news that a US consular officer had been killed in a terrorist attack on the consulate in Karachi. But this did not prevent Bush from staying at the American ambassador's residence or continuing with his trip as planned. During his discussions, he focused on the fight against extremists and the full civilianization of Musharraf's regime. Bush pushed Musharraf to shed his military affiliation and govern as a civilian. He promised to do it, but he wasn't in much of a hurry. By 2007, the Bush administration's view of Musharraf and Pakistan had changed significantly. On February 26, Cheney and CIA Deputy Director Steve Capps warned Musharraf during an unannounced visit to Islamabad that the tribal areas along the border with Afghanistan had become a safe haven for both the Taliban and al-Qaeda. After realizing that Musharraf and the Pakistan army were unable or unwilling to deal with the problem, the United States ramped up the use of armed drones, unmanned aerial vehicles, in the region. The US tone was becoming tougher. Pakistan's media characterized the American message as "do more." But both officials and leaders of public opinion rejected the suggestion that Pakistan had become the epicenter of global terrorism. Pakistan does not accept dictation from any side or any source, an indignant official said in response to reports of Cheney's demands. When members of Congress talked about cutting aid, Pakistani officials responded by condemning discriminatory legislation. During the summer of 2007, Musharraf faced his strongest domestic challenge. Opposition parties joined lawyers protesting the sacking of the Pakistan Chief Justice, who had until then been a Musharraf ally. Religious parties and retired servicemen supported the protests more out of their distaste for Musharraf than concern for full democracy. For the first time, there was a chink in Musharraf's armour, and it seemed that he might not be able to retain complete authority. He had already ruled for 8 years. No Pakistani dictator had lasted more than a decade in power. The Bush administration recognized the need to look beyond Musharraf. US diplomats reached out to Bhutto and Sharif, both of whom were in exile. Sharif still had to overcome his agreement with Musharraf involving the Saudis. But Benazir Bhutto was ready to return to Pakistan. She and her husband had faced legal proceedings and corruption cases that had dragged on, all with no result. Zardari had spent more than 11 years of his life in prison without being convicted of a single crime. Bhutto asked the Americans to demand that Musharraf provide her party a level field by ending prosecution that amounted to persecution. From exile, Bhutto had spoken out against extremism. She had also castigated Pakistan's inadequate response to the terrorist challenge, promising a more robust policy if she came to power. Her argument that a democratic leader could fight terrorism more effectively appealed to Washington. The US ambassador, Ann Patterson, reported from Islamabad that her party has more political legitimacy than any other party in Pakistan. On Bhutto's return to Pakistan on October the 18th, hundreds of thousands of supporters in Karachi received her. The US Embassy estimated the crowd to be between 500,000 to 2 million. She will have to fight for the right to again become Pakistan's Prime Minister, observed Patterson. But for today, she is basking in the applause of hundreds of thousands of fans. A suicide bomber attacked her rally, killing 136 people and injuring more than 450. Bhutto survived and continued her campaign. Bhutto's return paved the way for Sharif to break his 10-year exile deal and come back to Pakistan. On November the 28th, Musharraf retired as Chief of Army Staff and handed the baton to General Ashfaq Pervaz Kayani, who had previously served as the head of the ISI. Kayani was the first spy chief to lead the army. As a young officer, he had studied at the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. Reflecting the American tradition of optimism about personnel changes, Pentagon officials now pinned their hopes on Kayani. In background briefings, he was described as pro-American and anti-extremism. Then, on December the 27th, 2007, in a second suicide attack, Bhutto was assassinated. In conversations with several people, including me, she had expressed concern over Musharraf's refusal to provide her adequate security. Nonetheless, she refused to stop campaigning in what she said was a final battle to save Pakistan from obscurantism. Her death was mourned across the board in Pakistan, even by erstwhile opponents. Her followers saw her as a martyr. When elections were held in February 2008, Bhutto's PPP, now led by her widower, Zardari, won the most seats in Parliament. Zardari named party loyalist Yusuf Reza Gilani as Prime Minister. I was named Pakistan's ambassador to Washington and presented my credentials to Bush in May 2008. Zardari replaced Musharraf as President of Pakistan in September 2008, after Musharraf resigned when faced with impeachment. The Americans now had a new set of interlocutors. We were eager to fight terrorism for Pakistan's sake and to redefine Pakistan's relationship with the United States. Chapter 7. Parallel Universes. On May the 11th, 2011, I sat down for what turned out to be a grim conversation with the U.S. Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan, Mark Grossman. The well-reputed diplomat had succeeded Richard Holbrooke as the Obama administration's point man for the two troubled countries. 10 days earlier, U.S. Special Forces had killed al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden in Abbottabad, a Pakistani garrison town that was home to the Pakistan Military Academy. In response, a wave of anger directed at the Americans swept over Pakistan. The view in Islamabad was that the United States had violated Pakistani sovereignty. As an ally, Pakistanis thought, the United States should have conducted the Abbottabad raid jointly with Pakistani troops. Grossman spoke softly, as he always did, but his message was unmistakably tough. He was in Islamabad soon after the bin Laden raid and found the atmosphere there surrealistic. He said that explaining to Americans how the world's most wanted terrorist could be in hiding in as important a city as Abbottabad was difficult. According to Grossman, some forces in Pakistan were still not willing to confront the fact that bin Laden was hiding in Pakistan. He explained that if Secretary of State Hillary Clinton were to visit Pakistan later in the year, as planned, she would raise some critical questions to the Pakistani leadership. The two countries needed to discuss the essence and direction of future relations if this relationship is to be salvaged. The United States wanted access to the family of bin Laden. It wanted an investigation into how he and his family were residing in Abbottabad. Above all, Pakistan needed to stop blaming the United States and start facing the fact that somebody, somewhere in Pakistan, was responsible for protecting an international terrorist mastermind. The next day I was asked to come to the White House for a meeting with Lieutenant General Douglas Lute, the National Security Council's coordinator for Afghanistan and Pakistan. Lute had dealt with issues relating to the war in Afghanistan, as well as relations with Pakistan for several years. He had served under President Bush and had continued under Obama. As a soldier, he was always more frank than the diplomats. But this time, he seemed to choose his words carefully. Lute said that the United States and Pakistan had come to forks in their relationship in the past, where one path led to isolation and the other to continued partnership. In many of these cases, the two countries had chosen the path of partnership. This is one such moment, he insisted. Loot objected to the tone in Pakistan over the bin Laden incident. He said the government of Pakistan took too long to educate its people about the event in Abbottabad. For Americans, Prime Minister Gilani's address to the nation was disappointing, as it did not address the key question regarding bin Laden's presence in Pakistan. A CIA official present at the meeting said that Pakistan would gain nothing by stepping up anti-American rhetoric. The poison thus spread will last longer and much beyond the time when the two militaries and intelligence agencies have made up, he said. He was basing his statement on past experience. By now, the Americans obviously understood that whipping up public sentiment was often the Pakistan military's modus operandi for seeking a new deal for aid and arms. Then Loot made a veiled threat. Countries have been designated state sponsors of terrorism on less evidence than that available on Pakistan, he said. US Navy SEALs had found a whole treasure trove of material at the compound where bin Laden was killed. There were many unanswered questions. Instead of responding to these questions quietly, however, Pakistan was raising the level of noise. If the noise did not stop, Loot said, the United States could reveal its findings publicly. Once the role of Pakistan was revealed, the US public and Congress would demand measures that may go well beyond the past pattern of only cutting off aid. For several months then, the killing of bin Laden cast a shadow over US-Pakistan relations. Pakistan demanded that the United States vacate the Shamsi air base in the Baluchistan desert that it had used for operating drones over Pakistan's tribal areas. The United States agreed because Pakistan had the legal right to terminate the base, and Americans had alternative staging sites for the drones anyway. Islamabad then asked for a comprehensive treaty between the two countries to regulate all aspects of the relationship. Washington said that would take time. The United States then slowed the flow of aid, but did not cut it off. Pakistanis thought the worst was over. On September 13th, 2011, terrorists attacked the American embassy in Kabul. Grossman called me into the State Department for what I knew would be another difficult meeting. As I sat down in his ground-floor office, he exclaimed, "We had a terrible day yesterday." The Afghan Haqqani network, which was based in Pakistan's tribal areas, had apparently perpetrated the embassy attacks. For years, the United States had asked Pakistan to act against them, but the ISI considered them allies since the days of the anti-Soviet jihad. A truck bomb a few days earlier, which injured 77 Americans, was also traced to the same terrorist group. Grossman said that the latest attack in Kabul would now be the main topic of discussion for the meeting between Clinton and Pakistan's Foreign Minister, Hina Rabbani Khan, which was to take place in a few days. Pakistan wanted to discuss a memorandum of understanding as a first step toward a full-fledged treaty. Grossman said it seemed that the two sides were in parallel universes. Pakistanis spoke about everything but terrorism, pretending it was not happening. What we need, he said, is a conversation among adults trying to solve a problem. It was time to put it all out there. The US diplomat shared with me his frustrations in dealing with Pakistan. Soon after he came to office in January, CIA contractor Raymond Davis had killed 2 Pakistanis in Lahore on suspicion of trying to rob him. The United States had claimed diplomatic immunity. Davis had been in Pakistan for 3 years, but the US Embassy had never notified the Pakistan government that he was a diplomat. The ISI then fueled protests over American efforts to spy on Pakistan through men like Davis. Davis was released when a judge allowed him to pay blood money to the victims' relatives. Islamic law had provided a face-saver. The ISI also managed to seek more details about CIA personnel in Pakistan after helping Davis win his freedom. But Grossman recalled that the incident marked a downward spiral in the US-Pakistan relationship that had hit rock bottom after the United States discovered bin Laden in Abbottabad. The best way to strengthen relations between nations was to civilianize and privatize them, he said. At that time, 90% of Pakistan's relations with the United States were government-related. They involved military to military, intelligence to intelligence, and State Department to Foreign Office interaction. Business, investment, travel, tourism, education, and everything else represented only 10% of ties. According to Grossman, healthy bilateral relations were usually 60% private and 40% government. He went on to say that the US Geological Survey had conducted flights in Afghanistan and revealed a wealth of rare earth metals. The logical conclusion was that something like that was also present on the Pakistani side, since geology does not follow the Durand Line. But, he argued, there was something wrong in a relationship when Pakistan would not even allow a flight of the Geological Survey because of the fear that you want our nukes, he said wistfully. As Pakistan's ambassador, I could not tell my American counterpart that in my heart I agreed with his analysis. Clinton met Carr at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York a few days later. She had been a friend to Pakistan as First Lady, Senator, and now as Secretary of State. During this meeting, which I attended, she also voiced her exasperation over Pakistan's policies. According to Clinton, there was significant evidence that the Haqqani network based in Miran Shah, in Pakistan's North Waziristan province, organized and executed the attacks on the US Embassy and ISAF headquarters in Kabul. There had been communication between the Haqqani network and elements within the Pakistan government prior to the attack. We know the relationship between the Haqqani network and the Pakistan Army and ISI, Clinton said. The United States believed that Pakistani officials shared intelligence with the network and facilitated movement of its operatives. The Haqqani network moved men and materials across the border, and some of its operatives who moved in just prior to the recent attacks were still in Afghanistan awaiting orders. This was not intelligence provided by Afghans or Indians, but gathered from many sources, Clinton explained. The United States wanted Pakistan to act against the Haqqani network, or to let the United States punish them by ending ISI facilitation for the terrorists. It also wanted decisive action against Lashkar-e-Taiba, a Pakistani group that had links to al-Qaeda and was involved in the November 2008 terrorist attacks in Mumbai. Clinton also shared what she described as US concern about governance issues. She supported democracy in Pakistan, but found the civilian government adrift. One can't pretend that the military and ISI are not following a different agenda from the civilian leaders, she observed. Clinton also complained that there was an effort to paint everything the United States did for Pakistan negatively. This effort is led by the ISI, she said meaningfully. The Pakistani media environment was toxic with anti-United States stories that had no basis. There were concerted efforts to shape a negative public opinion of the United States. Pakistan can better inform its public, the top US diplomat asserted. When the United States criticized Pakistan, she noted, it did so openly and officially. But anti-United States statements and stories in Pakistan were unattributed, and the hidden hand behind these needed to be curbed. Pakistan, Clinton said, has entire machinery devoted to sowing hatred against the United States. In an effort to address all possible issues, Clinton then took up the nuclear question. The US has said many times that it has no intention to denuclearize Pakistan, she pointed out. If Pakistan wanted to be accepted as a nuclear state and be considered for a civil nuclear option in the future, then there was no reason for it to oppose proliferation of fissile material. The United States had invited Israel and India, the other countries outside the Non-Proliferation Treaty, to work with the major powers on fissile cutoff. Pakistan, then, was the only intransigent one. She made clear that the United States' interest was solely about fissile material falling into terrorist hands. It was one thing to invest in a nuclear program for your own security, Clinton went on. This was a sovereign decision Pakistan took, as did India and Israel. But Pakistan went ahead and proliferated to Libya and North Korea. Pakistan's leaders should not act as if there were no difference between Pakistan's behavior and that of Israel and India in nuclear matters, she stated. If Pakistan wants parity with these countries, it should act like them, she concluded. Pakistan had to overcome the mistrust engendered by onward proliferation. Carr's response only proved Clinton's points. Instead of addressing the specific issues, she insisted that the US should not humiliate Pakistan and its institutions publicly. Pakistan needed rock-solid evidence on ISI's alleged ties to terrorists, she said. Our sacrifices and contribution to the counter-terrorism effort must also be fully appreciated. The American representatives shook their heads as Carr stated that Pakistan was being made a scapegoat. After Clinton had left the room, Carr told other Pakistani participants that, in her opinion, the meeting had gone well. I told her frankly that her bland statements had cut no ice with the Americans. Pakistan needed to address the substantive issues, I said, or we risked far more than our relations with the United States. During her years in exile from 1997 to 2007, Benazir Bhutto had given great thought to dealing with Pakistan's myriad problems. She realized that her previous stints as Prime Minister had not lived up to her promises. On both occasions, the elected government was not allowed to complete its term. Although the army and ISI had made it difficult to alter Pakistan's national security policies, civilian leaders' inexperience and lack of preparation had also impeded their success, as had their reputation for corruption. Bhutto wanted to be better prepared if she got a third chance to lead the country. A few months after 9/11, I had opted for exile in the United States. In 1999, after irritating the Sharif government, I spent a few months under arrest. As is often the case in Pakistan, Pakistan Federal Investigating Agency, FIA, had initiated false criminal cases against me to cover up political motivations. As a vocal critic of Musharraf, I could not expect to be spared under military rule. Thus, the prospects of teaching at a US university and researching at an American think tank were far preferable to the possibility of another spell in prison. Bhutto and I met regularly during her visits to the United States, where she was well liked on the lecture circuit. We discussed Pakistan's future. I often shared the findings of my research, which shed a very different light on the country's history from what most Pakistanis have been led to believe. In 2005, Sadari arrived in the United States for medical treatment after 8.5 years in prison. My wife Faranoz Isfahani and I continued our discussions about Pakistan with Bhutto and Sadari. On most occasions, Bhutto identified terrorism and military rule as Pakistan's greatest problems. She argued that Pakistan could not make any progress without tackling the terrorist menace. The country also had to turn away from militarism and invest in its people. Education, healthcare, and infrastructure should take priority over spending endlessly in the name of national security. Pakistan, she felt, had become less secure as a result of neglecting human development. The policy of using non-state actors to bolster national security had backfired, and jihadi terrorists now posed a major risk to Pakistan. In Pakistan Between Mosque and Military, published in 2005, I documented the long-standing ties between Pakistan's Islamists and the state security apparatus. I argued that US aid for military regimes in Pakistan had not only undermined Pakistani democracy, it had also inadvertently helped foster religious extremism. In a comment that offended Pakistan's military, I said that Pakistan had become a rentier state. It lived off payments from a superpower for its strategic location and intelligence cooperation, rather than on the strength of the productivity of its economy. Bhutto asked me to write a paper for her on how the foreign policy of a future democratic government should differ from that of the previous military regimes. In my paper, I pointed out that Pakistan had made a mistake when it attempted to become a regional power while also being dependent on assistance from other countries. A better option for Pakistan would be to normalize relations with India and Afghanistan. Chinese President Jiang Zemin had also suggested just that in his address to the Pakistani parliament in December 1996. We should look at the differences or disputes with neighbours from a long perspective, Zemin had said, suggesting, if certain issues cannot be resolved for the time being, they may be shelved temporarily so that they will not affect the normal state-to-state relations. His message to Pakistanis, whom he called China's friends in need and brothers bound by common fate, had been unmistakable. Pakistan should not allow disputes with its neighbours to hold its foreign relations hostage. It should set aside the unresolved issues and pursue normal relations for its longer-term stability. I argued in my paper for Bhutto that just as China did not give up its rights over Taiwan, Pakistan need not give up its claim on Kashmir. But it should start trade with India, which would enhance Pakistan's economic growth. It would also ensure peace, which is a precondition for development. In the case of Afghanistan, Pakistan should befriend the government in Kabul instead of trying to impose one of its choosing. Pakistan would need to put all terrorist groups out of action, come clean on its nuclear program, and admit that its resentment of the United States was because we were dependent on it. Since 1947, dependence, deception, and defiance have characterized US-Pakistan relations. We sought US aid in return for promises we did not keep. Although even strong allies do not have 100% congruence of interests, in the case of Pakistan and the United States, the divergence far exceeded the similarities. Pakistan wanted to be able to act like Hafez Assad Syria, while demanding that the United States treat us like Israel. In dealing with terrorism, Pakistan could follow Colombia's model. There, with American backing, President Alvaro Uribe and his political allies confronted the lawlessness the drug cartels created. Pakistan could likewise shed the tag of a failing state by dealing with the problem and restoring the writ of the state. Instead of using public opinion as an excuse to refuse action, Pakistan's leaders could build public opinion in favor of their new national agenda. Bhutto and Zardari were intrigued by the idea of a new relationship with the United States that would be strategic rather than tactical, based, as it had been in the past, on asking for aid. They agreed with the concept of a self-confident Pakistan, free of the burdens of past blunders. Eliminating terrorism would be a future civilian government's first priority. Pakistan would work closely with the United States for this purpose. In return, we would seek US assistance, but it would be directed towards standing on our own rather than being dependent on another. Within a few years, Pakistan would be pursuing trade instead of depending on aid. After Bhutto's assassination and the subsequent elections, the PPP-led coalition government proceeded to implement this vision. But without Bhutto, mobilizing public opinion for a major shift in Pakistan's orientation proved difficult. Within weeks of taking office, the government became mired in domestic controversies, gaining a reputation for ineptitude and corruption. The military and the ISI refused to fully subordinate themselves to the civilians. On issues that mattered to the Americans, the civilians were simply unable to deliver. Gilani and Zardari asked for American patience, often citing their domestic compulsions. They believed that their responsibility for Pakistani policies relating to terrorism and nuclear proliferation started after they came to power, and thus they should not be blamed for difficulties they had inherited. They often blamed the United States for its past support for Zia and Musharraf, to whom they attributed many of Pakistan's current troubles. Consequently, the United States often found civilian officials repeating explanations and excuses they had heard before, instead of discussing solutions for long-standing problems. When the civilian government first came into office, the Bush administration offered it full US support. Soon after his election as Prime Minister, Gilani met Bush on the sidelines of a conference at the Egyptian resort town of Sharm el-Sheikh. Gilani emphasized his commitment to fighting terrorism because I have lost my own great leader, Benazir Bhutto, to extremists. Bush was visibly moved. Gilani was invited to Washington, where Bush reiterated his support. Within days of Zardari's election as president, Bush met him in New York on the occasion of the UN General Assembly session. Zardari was concerned about Pakistan's economy, which had been jolted by the year of anti-Musharraf protests. Foreign exchange reserves had dipped to precarious levels. But the US economy was going through its own crisis. In a meeting with the editors of the Wall Street Journal, Zardari had proposed that the United States infuse $100 billion into the Pakistan economy as aid, investments, and bank deposits. Instead, officials in the Bush administration helped Pakistan secure $7.6 billion from the IMF. This audiobook is continued on Disc 12.